God Hand is the most fun that I've had with a video game in years. It very quickly fought its way onto my favorite games list. I've replayed it 5 times in the span of 2 months, and I'm probably going to rename my dog Gene. Such is my love for this masterpiece. But it's not enough that I played it. Everyone needs to know about the glory of God Hand. So, sit back and let me explain why you should play it too. Because God Hand is God tier. God Hand is difficult to describe.
Hey! Sweetie! You're not going anywhere until you answer our quiz question! He's such a sexy man! Just my type!
I'm not that kind of guy!
Very difficult. It was made by Clover Studio, who made these, now defunct, which bore Platinum Games, who made these, and directed by Shinji Mikami, who made these. So, just from that lineage, you probably already have a pretty good idea of what to expect here. If I were a quote-unquote professional games journalist, just copy-pasting a description off of Wikipedia, I would say, God Hand is a third-person brawler with a heavy focus on comedy and stylish, over-the-top combat. And then I give it a 3 out of 10. But I think it's more accurate to say that God Hand is what would happen if Dark Souls and Doom had a baby who grew up into a horny 14-year-old that became obsessed with Fist of the North Star. The first thing you need to know about God Hand is that it's hard. Incredibly hard, even when you know what you're doing. But it's also fair. You lose only if you suck, and so all you have to do to win is get good. Now, as is tradition, I'm sure you're expecting me to bring in a comparison to Dark Souls here, as indeed I did just a few sentences ago. But God Hand actually came out before Dark Souls. Before Demon Souls, even. Honestly, I'd argue that God Hand was one of the first ever video games to incorporate the Dark Souls style mentality of hard but fair, as opposed to just being easy, or hard because the creators were bad at their jobs or wanted your arcade tokens. So, in fact, God Hand is not the Dark Souls of fighting games, but rather, Dark Souls is the God Hand of RPGs. Now, snark aside, the game is difficult, but only because the creators want you to be really good at playing it. And so, they make skillful play the only way to survive. The fighting in God Hand is incredible. I love it so much. The basic moment-to-moment combat boils down to a dance. The enemy has a bunch of combos, and the main way to succeed is to learn them all, what their wind-up animations look like, and how each of them can be avoided. Then, once you've done that, it's about having the dexterity and general knowledge to actually avoid them. And then about how to do that faster. And then about how to do that with 2 enemies at once. And then 3, and then 4, and then about how to do all of that while looking like a badass. Yeah, the end goal of God Hand isn't just to beat the game. You can do that by spamming high sidekick and then backflipping right up into the end. No, the end goal of God Hand is to beat the game while looking amazing and styling on all your opponents. To know enough and be fast enough that you become as big a badass as the game says you are. And after enough practice, in the form of getting your ass kicked over and over and over again, it finally clicks. You know every single enemy type, and you know every single attack they all have. And you know how to dodge all of those attacks. And you're doing it. You're doing it right now. Your hands are flying across the controller, eyes darting from left to right, mind racing, trying to decide how to handle this group of enemies as best as possible on a second-to-second basis. You've ascended, and you feel like a god. This is what I call enlightenment. When you counter every move, launch enemies, curb stomp demons, and effortlessly glide your way through a crowd of goons who pose zero threat to you because you are just that good. When you nod your head and tap your foot to the music, when the controller stops existing and you're acting purely on instinct and reflex, when pummeling an enemy and launching them makes you go, yeah! That is the high that I chase, and that is what keeps me coming back to play God Hand again and again. But anyways, I get ahead of myself. Also, all that footage was stolen. I'm not that good. So, let's talk specifics. To borrow some corporate jargon, I think there are 4 main pillars of design that make God Hand's combat so amazing. 1. Controls and dodging. 2. Satisfying game feel. 3. Build your own combos. And 4. Dynamic difficulty. So let's go through all those in order. One of the things that makes God Hand unfriendly to newcomers is that the main character and all-around incredible doofus, Gene, has tank controls. Pretty much exactly like Leon in Resident Evil 4, which I guess is just how Shinji Mikami likes to make things. A lot of people then take this to mean that the game has bad controls, but a lot of people are idiots. Granted, it is a bit weird when you're unfamiliar with it and all the little things you can do to make it easier for yourself. For example, keeping an eye on the minimap, pressing L1 to do a 180 spin, or how using a roulette move will lock on and spin you towards the closest enemy. But it's important to understand that the game wasn't designed like this because they wanted to be unique or weird or whatever. It was designed like this because it works really well. The locked-off over-the-shoulder camera helps you feel up close and personal in the action, while keeping everything clear and readable, in a way that gets lost in some similar titles like Bayonetta, where the pulled-away camera means the combat can devolve into visual soup. Which is really important in a game like God Hand, because you need to be able to see what the enemy is doing so you can figure out what you're going to do about it. And as a bonus, because of the tank control setup and locked-off camera, that means we have entirely freed up the right analog stick to do anything else we could want. For example, dodging. God Hand's dodge mechanic is one of the best things in the entire game, and that's because there are actually 3 different kinds of dodging that you have to switch between as the situation demands. As I said, the right analog stick is exclusively devoted to it. And once you understand how it works and get a feel for it, it works so well that this one mechanic single-handedly justifies the game's controls over something more traditional. So, pressing the stick forward does an up dodge, then left and right do the appropriate side dashes, and then down is a backflip. Now, what I've noticed is that back dodge tends to be what new players use the most because it's easy, gives you a good chunk of invincibility frames, and very obviously gets you out of harm's way. And while it is good, and I'd never say don't use it, I would say that when it comes to experiencing what I think the game excels at, ideally, it should be the dodge you're doing the least. The problem with back dodge is that it ruins the flow of the fight. For example, this enemy right here has an attack where he does 4 really fast punches, followed by a 5th and final big hit. Backdodging his attack absolutely works, but now you've removed yourself from the tempo temporarily, and you're just waiting for him to finish his combo so you can walk back up and start from scratch. It's the easiest way to dodge the attack, but it cuts off the flow of the fight, and the end result is a reset of the status quo, where neither of you have the advantage. But that's what up dodge is perfect for. Now, what's up dodge? Well, it's essentially a quick duck that can be spammed. It's a bit trickier to pull off, but if you up dodge each of his hits, you stay in his face and inside the rhythm of the dance. And since you know that his 5th hit takes a while to wind up, you can abuse that knowledge. Duck, 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 duck 4 times, and then goose, a quick jab to the face stuns him. Interrupting an enemy's combo like that gives you a critical hit, which doubles the damage of your smack and increases the chance that the enemy will enter a stunned state, where you can move in for as stylish a kill as you want. All of these benefits mean that in this particular circumstance, up dodging is the superior choice. But, you know, only a Sith deals in absolutes. There are moves that can only be avoided with back dodge, and it's also great from disengaging from fights to reset if you find yourself on the losing end of things. So don't not use it, but just be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of each of the options at your disposal. Side dodge, then, is somewhere in the middle. It keeps you in the enemy's face, like up dodge, while avoiding attacks that up dodge can't. The big drawback, though, is that it's a lot more situational than the other two. Doesn't matter how many times you side dodge, you won't avoid attacks like this. So this type of dodge increases in its usefulness as your own knowledge of the game builds as you play through it. But all 3 of their powers combined means that you have the ability to avoid every single attack in God Hand. And mastering all 3 is one of the keys to reaching enlightenment, to achieving that feeling of zen and becoming one with the game, and being able to flow through a massive brawl like water. And it's so satisfying. And when it comes to the combat in God Hand, the word of the day really is satisfying. Incredibly satisfying gameplay design. And explaining why that's the case is tricky. Like, why is punching people in Game X not satisfying, but punching people in God Hand is? Well, that's tricky because it isn't just one thing. It's like with an orchestra. Listening to someone play, Toccata and Fugue in D minor on just the violin, or just the flute or whatever, can hardly be described as a magical experience. But when they're all playing together, magic is exactly the right word for it. God Hand isn't good just because of the difference in sound when punching normally versus when punching after breaking a block. And it isn't just the way the enemies bounce when you curb stomp them and go, with each and every flop. And it's not just the crowd in the background that cheers for you when you succeed and gets disappointed when you inevitably suck. None of that individually is a big deal, but when you add it all together, continuing to pack layers and layers of intensely satisfying design on top of each other, at some point a difference in scale becomes a difference in kind, and it all builds in on itself, and you enter a perpetual loop of incredible gameplay. The kind you normally only find in, like, Doom 2016. And the music also helps with that. In particular, I adore Gene's Rockabye and Smoking Realista, as do the incredible animations, especially considering God Hand was a PS2 game. When someone gets punched in God Hand, I wince in sympathy, because it looked and sounded like it hurt in a way that even modern games have difficulty with. Every punch in God Hand is weighty, every kick is satisfying, and oh my god, the QTEs. So when an enemy gets particularly weak, you get the option to really rub your victory in their face with a pummel prompt. And every single press of the circle button is one punch on the screen. So the faster you press, the more satisfying hits you get in, one after the other, leading to the crescendo BAM! Launching them like a fucking rocket straight back, and it's the most satisfying thing in the world. And when it comes to the amazing animations, there's a lot of them. One of God Hand's claims to fame is a dynamic move list. As you play, you unlock moves by beating enemies, completing challenges, and buying them from your local bunny girl, and they can be instantly swapped around and remapped in the menu whenever you want. This means there are tons of different combat styles and ways to play, and a super high skill ceiling for the people who want to really experiment and get the most out of their options. Of course, don't be too intimidated by this if you don't want. The default loadout the game gives you is really good, and can absolutely take you to the ending with only some minor upgrades along the way. But for the people that want to really dig into a game, there's tons of depth here waiting for you. And the new moves aren't just more powerful versions of the old ones. Well, mostly. A lot of the moves in God Hand have properties that allow you to affect your enemies in different ways. Reverse Sweep, for example, ducks under a lot of attacks while doing damage and tripping the opponent up, making it a great tool to interrupt combos with. Spinning Back Fist breaks an enemy's guard. Palm Smash launches an enemy backwards. Yes Ma'am Kablam doesn't do any damage and takes forever, but charges your God Hand if you actually land a hit with it. All of these attacks affect you or your enemies in different ways to suit different situations. This keeps you constantly thinking, constantly on your toes, because God Hand isn't just a game for people who want to punch things, it's also a game for classy, sophisticated people who like to read books. Specific kinds of books, but still, books. And speaking of things that are hard, the game is not only difficult, but becomes increasingly more so as you play, thanks to the genius implementation of a dynamic leveling system, indicated by this little bar in the bottom left. The better you do, the more the bar goes up. Level 1, Level 2, Level 3, and Level Die. Each level means the enemies hit harder, move faster, and pull out new attacks. On my first playthrough of the game, I mostly stuck around levels 1 and 2, but as I said at the start, I've replayed it a ton, and am now consistently on level 3 and Level Die. And visibly improving like that over the course of playing is one of my absolute favorite things about video games as a medium. But if you can't take the heat, get on your knees and grovel, which brings you all the way back down to level 1. But despite being a make the game easier button that you can just press all the time, God Hand does a great job making this a humiliating option that you really don't want to have to resort to. I mean, the whole game is about improving yourself and your skill to the point that you can not only win against enemies, but style on them. So, having to bite the curb and beg all of these Mad Max rejects to please be nicer is the exact opposite of what you want. Like, I am personally letting the developers down whenever I have to use it. Come on, Sai, I expected better of you. I'm Shinji Mikami, this is how I talk. And all of these things combined result in a game that is incredible to play. Duck a series of attacks, interrupt a combo, couple punches to the ribs, tapping your foot to the music, break his block, bam, satisfying counter hits, trip him up, heel drop, launch him into the sky, the controller doesn't exist. Sure you can, launch him into his friends, difficulty level up, the crowd cheers, get your ass kicked, die, repeat. This is Zen. This is ecstasy in the form of a video game. This is one of the most perfectly crafted experiences I have ever played. And IGN gave it a 3. Yeah, the intense difficulty that practically defines the game rather famously backfired on it. God Hand was received incredibly poorly when it released back in 2006, and as I say, there's a particularly infamous IGN review giving it a 3 out of 10. But while that's easy to make fun of, I do kinda get it. Like I said earlier, God Hand released at a time where difficulty was primarily associated with bad or poorly designed games. I mean, the reason everyone compares every new difficult game to Dark Souls is that Dark Souls marked a huge turning point in public opinion about difficulty. And back then, nobody really knew how to deal with God Hand since it required time and practice to really shine properly. which is why one of the best games ever made was a commercial flop, and why we'll probably never see a God Hand 2. But that's why I am really glad we're starting to see God Hand re-emerge in the popular consciousness. Between some high-profile YouTube channels like Seth, Turbo Button, H-Bomber Guy, and me mentioning God Hand or making whole videos about it, it's really starting to shine again and get the recognition it deserved in the first place. I am 100% confident that if this game were released today, in the age of Dark Souls, it would be 10 times better received. And I'm really glad that's hopefully starting to happen.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But you kids are gonna love it.
Of course, if the game did come out today, one of the things that might not be received so well is the comedy. God Hand is offensive, crass, and objectionable in all of the best possible ways. As was shown earlier, the first mini-boss you fight are two gay men, one of which is, quote, packing no heat, must have lost his balls in the war. There's also spanking dominatrixes, fat Mexican demons who are only one step above saying "esse" all the time, a boss whose quirky and funny gimmick is that he's the black one, an alternate bunny girl costume for Olivia, with very impressive for the era jiggle physics by the way, and the glory of the Mad Midget 5.
Card Gone Wild, Joker! One hard gangsta, Diamond! You can find me at the club! Have your pet neutered or spayed! Ow, 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 I'm hurt! I mean hurt! Together we are the Mad Midget 5!
Douchebags.
If this game were released today, there would undoubtedly be countless think pieces and ideologues decrying it for being racist, sexist, homophobic, pretty much every bad Tumblr word under the sun. But I don't think it's actually any of those things. God Hand has an over-the-top, incredibly silly world that only exists to be funny and interesting for the player. Like, in no way do I think the developers actually hated women, Mexicans, or midgets. I just think this is supposed to be fun. And oh boy, is it ever. Fun, hysterical, and amazingly dumb.
Time to shuffle up and deal! I've got a killer hand!
I've got a killer hand!
You're gonna get it!
You're gonna get it!
Quit imitating me!
Ah, this is dumb. She went out again. Yeah!
I love it. The world, characters, and dialogue are a riot. But when it comes to God Hand's place in the legacy of comedy games, I think the most interesting thing it does is to make the combat funny too. Playing through God Hand, something I often find myself thinking about is the excellent video, Jackie Chan, How to Do Action Comedy, by Every Frame a Painting. The cliff notes of which can be summarized by Tony's opening line. Paraphrased, a lot of movies have comedy scenes, and a lot of movies have action scenes, but for 40 years, the master of combining the two was Jackie Chan. I think this can apply equally well to video games. A lot of games have comedy sequences, and a lot of games have action sequences, but rarely do the two meet. For example, let's pick on one of my favorites, Portal 2. The comedy of Portal 2 is limited to the ongoing radio show playing between test chambers, and aside from maybe a couple of examples, the giant vault door in Old Aperture springs to mind, there's nothing funny about the gameplay or the world. Like, if you played through Portal on mute, it would just be a puzzle game. Not so with God Hand, because even with the audio muted, the comedy still comes across vibrantly through, of course, the world and the characters, but also just through the combat. Even though fights in God Hand are always intense and incredibly difficult, I still often find myself pausing to laugh during them. Some of my favorites include the Ball Buster, which is equally funny when you know it doesn't work on women. If you're able to get a demon down to exactly 1 HP, you get a special button prompt for the Poke of God, which pops it like a balloon. But my favorite will always be this QuickTime event where you get out of a goon's grab attack. At the start of the game, he tries to grab you, and you break out and do it to him instead. But when you start encountering harder enemies later in the game, they'll break out of your grab, and so you have to break out of their grab again and grab them again. It makes me laugh every time. And even setting aside the quirky super moves, the basic combat is still hilarious. The reactions and facial expressions are incredible, especially for the time, and often all it takes is the look on Gene's face after being smacked to make me laugh. And since the game will be kicking your ass quite a bit, the developers put a lot of work into showing exactly how much pain Gene is going through. And not only is that funny, but again, going back to the Every Frame a Painting video, the fact that he gets his ass kicked so much does a great job of humanizing Gene, who could have easily just been a boring plank of wood fighting game protagonist, and making him feel like a lovable underdog, despite the God Hand making him stupidly overpowered. And on that note, I do adore Gene. Like, on one hand, he's the best martial artist in the world, capable of not only defeating any opponent, but styling on them while he's at it. He's the biggest badass in the universe, absurdly confident, and is constantly throwing out Schwarzenegger-style one-liners. But on the other God Hand, the game loves to remind you that he's a huge dork.
We'll let you off with a pass this time.
Yeah, you're all talk.
You're all a bunch of freaking idiots! Damn, that's a long way down.
Next time we'll duel you a killer hand!
Keep on rolling.
And in their own goofy and often nonsensical way, I really think they nailed the hero's journey with Gene. So in a flashback, we see that he started off as sort of a wandering loner.
Damn, I'm poor.
But gets pulled into trouble protecting Olivia from some demons who are searching for the God Hand. He tries to fight them, but quickly gets dispatched and they chop his arm off for the trouble. But surprise, Olivia did in fact have the God Hand, which she gives to Gene as thanks and in the hopes of him using its power to save the world. But he is very uninterested in picking a fight for the good of humanity or whatever, and so Olivia has to constantly strong-arm him into it, haha. And we see that Gene is haunted by his past failures, but through confronting them and the strength of the God Hand, he starts to regain his confidence and desire to protect people, even if Olivia still has to force his hand occasionally. But the second act twist is when Olivia gets kidnapped by the demons, and now Gene needs no external motivation to care. He is free to walk away, but chooses not to, and willingly confronts all the evils that stand in his way, right up to the amazing conclusion. And in addition to that, all the little moments of character and the story taking itself seriously for a change help to keep the game from feeling completely like a joke. Like Gene's growing friendship with Elvis throughout the game that culminates after his death, where he reverently puts the cigar back in his hand, or this quiet moment after Olivia tells him how she survived the death of her clan. She starts crying and he consoles her, but it's not long before he reverts back to his usual dorky self.
So, what base did he get to?
Don't worry, nothing happened.
Whew, that's what I thought.
And we see that for the first time in the game, Jean doesn't need to be forced into helping people.
Alright, so where's next?
And the subtle shift to a smile on her face as he runs out the door does so much of the heavy lifting for the writing and character development. And like, none of this is revolutionary or anything, but my point is that while the goofy story is fun and the lines are quotable, all of that is still built on a surprisingly solid foundation of competent writing and character development, which is one of those things that brings a game from good to great. Or, in this case, from great to an all-time classic. I can't say it enough. This game is incredible. One of the best ever made. A true masterpiece at every level. And you need to play it right now. But sigh, I don't even have a PS2. Well, luckily, you don't need one. Noted leader of the Merchants Guild, Seth, already did all the work for you. Included in the description is a link to his download of the entire game and the emulator needed to play it. You can be experiencing this majesty literally 5 minutes from now for free. And go watch his video while it downloads. It's the least you can do. Well, that about wraps it up this time. If you like this video and want to see more like it, I've got a Patreon where you can support me and my terrible life decisions. Anyways, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Later. Special thanks to Logomorphos and Isaiah Christo.
Power keeps my pimp hand strong, so trust me or you won't last very long. Dragon kick your ass into the Milky Way. Don't act like you don't like the Bulbasaur. My arm, my arm, my arm, my arm, my arm, my arm, a summon of the power of the God hand.
Hold it! Give up the God Hand, now!
Only thing I'm giving up is an ass kicking.